Welcome to Releasing Trauma, a Survivor's Podcast. I am your host, Tracy Osborne. I am a survivor of emotional bullying, rape, sexual assault, domestic abuse, and grief. After losing my husband in 2019, I set off on a new adventure to help other women release their trauma and create a life they can cherish. Each week, I will feature a guest expert or a survivor to share their stories, tips, wisdom, and more. The goal is so that you can take away even just the smallest nugget of information you can use in your life right now to make a change and to remind you that you're not alone. There is life after trauma, and you can move from victim to thriver and create a life you can cherish.
All right, this week's guest is Anthony Casablanca, and he is an accomplished senior executive and leadership consultant on grief and co-author of The Dying Art of Leadership, How Leaders Can Help Grieving Employees Excel at Work. Welcome, Anthony. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Oh, Tracy, thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here.
So we're going to put kind of a spin on things, listeners, because I know a lot of what we talk about on here is around domestic violence and sexual assault. We're going to kind of put a different spin on things. We're going to talk about grief, but we're also going to talk about grief in the workplace. And so for those of you who might be leaders, teams, team managers, team leaders, this is definitely the call that you need to listen to. So I'm really excited to dive in. Now, Anthony, before we start on that, you and I were talking before we got started, and we were talking about the fact that grief doesn't necessarily mean loss of a loved one. And I would love for you to kind of go into that a little bit and expand on that for our listeners.
Oh, sure, Tracy. I would love to. As you and I were talking, it's one of the major points that we try to get leaders and all of the readers of our book to understand is that grief, anytime there is an emotionally traumatic event that is close enough to the individual and deep enough to the individual that it alters their reality, changes their reality, those people can and often do enter the 5 stages of grief. And it can be, the most common one is, the one that people go to all the time is the loss of a loved one. But victims of domestic violence, victims of sexual abuse, folks who either themselves or their close family member gets diagnosed with a significant illness, parents with Alzheimer's, divorce, the list goes on and on and on. And so we try to get organizations to realize that frankly, the loss of a loved one is the smallest piece of the pie. That there are people grieving in their organizations today, silently suffering, that they don't really know about probably. Mm-hmm. And we encourage the leaders to engage those people and try to support them at a time when they need the support the most.
Oh, and it's so important because, luckily I haven't worked in the workplace in a very long time. I work from home for myself, but I've seen it and I've heard it. And again, I'm going to touch probably on loss of a loved one a lot on this call just because that's the most common when we talk about grief. But you get a week, maybe 2 weeks, depending on who the loved one is. And then they expect you to come back to work and be perfectly fine.
Right. And
I know from firsthand experience, after losing my dad, after losing my best friend, after losing my husband, I wasn't fine in 2 weeks.
Right.
I wasn't fine in 2 months. You know?
Right.
And luckily, that was back when I worked for myself, and so I could take the time off that I needed. But employers think about productivity and bottom line. And forget that their people are people.
Yeah, we address that in the book as well as in our training. And one of the things that my brother and I have distinguished is, managers manage metrics and productivity numbers and processes. Leaders lead people. Leaders are not there to, those numbers don't happen without the people. And we work really hard in our training session to get leaders to realize the magnitude of what we're talking about here. If I just take divorce, the death of a loved one, opioid addiction, and cancer diagnosis, if I just take those four things and assume that only one person is impacted by each of those events, 17.2 million people a year show up at work grieving. That means that anywhere between, if you have 100 people, for every 100 people in your organization, between 5 and 10 of them are grieving every single day in the workplace. That's a big number.
That's a huge number. And grief is not one of those things you can just leave at the door when you punch in.
It is not. And unfortunately, our society does not deal well, right, with grief in general.
Right.
Our society is hey, time heals all wounds. You'll get over it, depending on the situations, right? Oh, well, he's in a better place, right? We tell people all these platitudes. At least you were diagnosed early. Well, that sounds good, but if you're the one going through the cancer treatments, that might be true, but good. you're still going. You still have 6 months worth of treatments to go through that scare the 11 daylights out of you.
Right.
And so, and the workplace is even worse because leaders have never been trained on this. They've never been talked to about this. Organizations don't make it clear how they want their leaders to handle these situations. And frankly, the organizations don't have processes in place to deal with it. Time off is okay. That's a great thing. And some organizations have extended that time off. But as we've learned with what's going on with the lockdowns and COVID, and right, companies made lots of decisions about flexibility almost overnight. We believe leaders have lots of room, even within their current policies and cultures and structures, to be very supportive of folks if they're willing to engage and really understand what's going on, as opposed to just managing performance. If a leader waits to see that performance has slipped, it's too late, basically. So
Right.
those are the two big messages in our book. Grief is much bigger than just the death of a loved one, and leaders need to engage in the process. And if they do, they can actually help employees excel at work while they're grieving.
Well, no, I'd like to learn more about that. And also, how do these people, the leaders, how can they even tell? Because they're not trauma informed, they're not trained.
Right.
So, how do they even know some of the warning signs or the flags of somebody who is either suffering from trauma or grieving?
Right.
And then, what do they do with it?
Sure. So I can give you an example. We teach in our leadership training and in the principles of the book. We talk about some of the warning signs, right? Mm-hmm. Distraction, being late for meetings, changes in mood or behavior, crying, right? Emotional outbursts or outbreaks. Mm-hmm. Anything that demonstrates a shift. Leaders should wonder what's going on and engage in the grief process with the individual and talk about it. And I will give you a great example. This actually is a true story. And it was one that my brother encountered in one of his roles, but he was in a leadership role, and his team came to him and said that this individual, things just weren't quite right. They were very concerned about them. They were calling in at the day of the absence, right? So they'd call in on a Monday morning and say, "Hey, I can't come into work today." Their appearance and their work approach, their work ethic had slipped over the last several months. This person was also responsible for being on call, and they were very concerned that no matter what time of the day or night they called this person, they were always awake. Even 3 o'clock in the morning, it seemed like they were not getting this person up out of bed. And so they assumed that this person, they were younger, and they assumed that this person was partying and doing all kinds of things. And my brother decided to take a much different approach than just managing performance. So he sat down. He said, "You know what? We've published this book. I'm going to use what we've published." He sat down with this individual, not at work. He took them off site for a cup of coffee and just engaged in a discussion and said, "Look, we're concerned. Your job's not in jeopardy. I just want to know what's going on because I can't help you until I know what's going on."
Right.
And this person opened up to them. And as it turned out, there were incredible reasons for their behavior. The reason they were calling in at a moment's notice is because they were dealing with a medical issue, a very painful medical issue, and they would book an appointment based on the doctor's availability. But as soon as there was a cancellation and the doctor called, they would jump on getting the appointment so that they could get treated. So that was the absentee issues and some of the appearance issues. It also explained a little bit of the not sleeping. But then the person went on to say that they were coming up on their brother had died tragically in a car accident. Younger brother had died in a car accident, and that it was coming up on the 1-year anniversary of their death. That was weighing on them. And that this person had a younger sibling who was still living at home with their mother, and the mother was abusive. And this person would often get called in the middle of the night to go stop the abuse or take the younger sibling out of the home.
Oh my goodness.
And naturally, there was lots of emotion and lots of tears. My brother said, "Look, we want to help you. So let's just start. Now we know you need some flexibility, so don't worry about calling. If you need to go to the doctor, just call. If you can give us any notice, that's great, but we'll work around that." He went to the team and talked to the team, not so much about the specifics, but about how they could help absorb some of the responsibilities of this person. And immediately, when the meeting ended, when the cup of coffee was over, this person said they were so thankful that now they could talk about this at work. And the very next day, that person's appearance, work ethic, attitude immediately changed. And that person is today, this happened a couple of months ago, that person today is performing at a higher level than they did previously. And it was all because they could now raise their hand. They knew they were going to be supported at work.
Right.
And they could say, "I am struggling today. I need some help." And the organization and the team and their leader was going to understand why.
Yeah, that is fantastic.
So
and
that's what we teach.
And that proves right there that just having a little bit of empathy and caring towards your fellow human, let alone an employee, can go a very long way.
Right. Yes, very much so. So that's what our training's about. That is what the book is about. There's a leadership model in the book that we offer up to leaders and to organizations. And that's really our focus. We're not trying to make leaders grief counselors. We don't believe that's their role. They're not trained to do that.
Right.
And there is a bunch of people that are, but we do take the approach of, from a leadership perspective. I mean, this is an issue. Studies have been done. Grief in the workplace costs U.S. companies $75 billion a year in lost productivity.
I don't doubt that for a second.
And that's a very dated number. The Grief Recovery Institute did that study in 2003. Now, I have read that they are trying to redo that study and update that study. They haven't completed it yet, but they estimate that the number will be over $100 billion now. So this is a real issue, right? We're not talking about necessarily just touchy-feely, feel-good stuff, right? Nice to do stuff. This has benefits not only to the employee, but to the organization as well.
Well, if you've ever seen the show Undercover Boss,
yes.
I can't watch that show. I cry every time.
Yes.
You know, but that they're going undercover to not only find out about things about the company, but they start learning about these, just mind-boggling things that their employees are dealing with. I've seen them homeless, but they come to work, they live in their car, but they're at work every day with a smile on their face, or, dealing with a very sick child, or, whatever it is. These people are coming to work and they're trying to do their best. And the leaders are like, holy cow, nobody would have had a clue. And so it enables them to put things in place for employees to come forward and say, hey, I need help today.
Right. And that's the real issue here, right? We have found in our research that there's really four causes. There's really four issues at play here. We've talked about one, in that our culture in general in the U.S. does not deal well with grief, right? We tend to bury it. We don't want to confront it. We don't want to confront people who are experiencing it because we don't know what to say and we don't know what to do. And so we just assume that if we leave them alone, they'll be fine, right? The second is that leaders have never, there is no one else. There are no other leadership classes. There are no other leadership trainings. There are no other leadership companies whose sole focus is to teach leaders how to make leaders aware of this situation and how to provide them with the skills and the confidence to begin to approach this subject in the workplace. So that's the second issue. The third is organizations don't have processes to deal with this, right? Their emotional well-being processes are not very robust. And even if they've made changes to policies, they have not talked to their leaders about how they want their leaders to behave or provided them any guidance on how to deal with this. And the last one is, most organizations these days consider themselves to be high performance organizations, right? We have a high performance culture and a lean culture. And unfortunately, a lot of times, that sends a signal to employees. That culture sends a message to employees that it is not okay to raise your hand and say you're struggling. Because if you do, that's considered a sign of weakness and it's going to be held against you.
Right.
And quite honestly, if you are a lean purist, that is not true. Lean is actually all about respect for people, but most organizations just look at it as cost cutting. Mm-hmm. And if that's the culture of the organization, people are not comfortable raising their hand until leaders are vulnerable, empathetic, and compassionate, and demonstrate they really care about their people. And when they do that, then people will feel safe enough to raise their hands and say, hey, I am really struggling with this. And while I know you can't help me get my bills paid, if you think about the situation now with lockdowns and unemployment, and people have lost their second income, which oftentimes they need to pay their bills.
Right.
While people don't expect the company to pay their bills for them, they do want to be in an environment where they can say, I am really struggling here and I need some help. Because I have to leave early to help take care of my son because of he's not in school. His schools are closed and I need to go home so my wife can start her 2:00 job. And I didn't feel comfortable talking about that. If we can get leaders to engage in those discussions, miraculous things can happen. Productivity improves, morale improves, engagement improves, loyalty improves. Everything will improve when leaders take that approach.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When leaders look at their employees as people rather than a number.
Right. And as the show that you mentioned, Undercover Boss, oftentimes proves, the folks at the top of the organization, the way they think the organization is behaving and the way the organization actually behaves are two totally different things.
Completely.
And so a lot of times senior leaders want this type of behavior from their organization, but they don't realize that they're not getting it. And so that's where we come in, both with our book and our leadership training. Awesome.
Well, how can people get in touch with you, Anthony?
Sure. So our website is probably the easiest way, griefleaders.com.
Perfect.
And folks can read about the book and learn about what we do. And there's also ways to contact us there as well. And then they can follow us on LinkedIn, either myself or my brother. And we have a LinkedIn company page as well that they can follow us there.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been actually really fascinating. Like I said, even though I'm not in the workplace anymore.
Sure. Well, but a lot of your listeners
people
are.
Still are, and yeah, this has just been really fascinating for me. So I'm sure it has been for the listeners as well. I'm sitting over here. I've got Post-it notes everywhere from all the little notes I was taking and ideas that it triggered. So
well, that's awesome. And actually, one of the things folks can do on our website is actually tell us their story on one of the forms in the contact page.
Cool.
We would love to have your listeners go online and tell us their return to work or their leadership story around leading emotionally traumatized people, because that's how we shed light on this, is by getting those examples, and we're happy to read those and respond to those. And if you do have leaders who are listening, we're more than happy to jump on a complimentary consultative call if they'd like. So, yeah,
awesome.
Just
right.
Go to our website.
There you go. You have it, griefleaders.com. All right. Well, thank you again, Anthony, and listeners, as always, thank you so much for tuning in, and we will catch you next week on the show.